I'm joined down here in O'Connell Bridge House by the author Gerry Mullins, who has written the book Dublin Nazi No.1. Gerry, welcome.
Thank you.
Yes. Gerry, before I talk about this to you, because it's a fascinating book that's been incredibly well received, can I just put it to you, was it perhaps the publisher who came up with the title rather than yourself? Because, as I say, if we had have called it Dublin Archaeologist No.1, probably wouldn't have sold as many.
It's an interesting issue. Everybody who I dealt with on this book did not like that title. I was the only one who wanted it. The publisher didn't like it for various reasons. It's just something about it. Anyway, by just saying Dublin, even if you could put in the word Ireland, Ireland is #1 Nazi. Nazi, whether you like it or not, is a fantastic word to put into a book title or a film.
Oh,
it's like the word sex, it's like a small number of other words that attracts people's interest. So Nazi is a very good word. The publisher liked that, but Dublin makes it too colloquial. The Mahr family didn't like it. They don't dispute that their father was what he was, but they didn't like the idea of him being labelled Dublin Nazi #1. I think the word Nazi has got connotations in Germany that go beyond what somebody like me who lives in Dublin can understand. And even other people, my own agent didn't like the title of the book either. I felt it was necessary. #1, it was accurate because Dr. Mahr himself, Adolph Mahr, the actual subject of the book, did describe himself as Dublin Nazi #1. So I used the title he gave himself. And secondly, because these people didn't like the title, particularly the Mahr family, ironically, it gave me license. It gave me the desire to use it, and that is because I focused so much on Dr. Mahr, and I tried to give him a fair hearing in the book. He was a Nazi, but there are many, many different shades of Nazism, and I tried to disentangle the complicated messages that we normally get about that particular era, and try to show his true position on the whole spectrum of Nazism. I could have been, and I was actually accused of being a little bit soft on him, and by calling the book Dublin Nazi #1, it annoyed the family, and it kind of allowed me license. It basically reminded the listeners, if they started to like the guy at any stage during the book, there was a reminder right there in the cover always. He was Dublin Nazi #1. Don't start falling in love with this guy.
Yeah, it's interesting because particularly since the Cathal Shannon pieces that were on RTE, it was a period where very few people really knew much about what happened in Ireland in relation. The war we didn't even call the war; we called the emergency. Generally, it was almost don't mention the war sort of thing. And the generation that's there now probably would have had very little experience with it. Do you feel that there is now, essentially since you brought the book out and since Cathal brought his out as well, that there is more of an interest in that period, and there's a hell of a lot of stories to be told, several of which you tell in the Adolph Mahr book.
Well,
the Adolph Mahr book.
Adolph Mahr. We'll be talking about Albert Bender later on. Yeah. Well, is there a lot of stories? Of course there are a lot of stories. There are hundreds of millions of stories like this. What makes it unusual and attractive to an Irish audience is that because we were here in the emergency, most families have no direct link to World War II or the Holocaust. In fact, hardly any families in Ireland have a direct link to the Holocaust. I think there were only maybe 2 Irish citizens who died in the Holocaust. So what's unusual about this book is that it brings the Holocaust and it brings Nazism to an Irish audience and gives them a direct link to a family that was living in Dublin and going to school in Dublin and linked to the National Museum. I remember talking to an Austrian friend of mine and telling her this whole fascinating story. This is what I still write in the book, and I come across all this fascinating material, and she said, oh yeah, it's the same in our family. My grandfather was like that and my grandmother was like that, and so the great drama that I was describing to her and to other people who were German and Austrian is a little bit run of the mill to them.
Yes. Can I ask? The impression I got is that you didn't necessarily start off to write a book about Adolph Mahr, that the character that grabbed your interest initially was Albert Bender. Tell us, how accurate is that, or is that being a bit fanciful?
No, it's entirely true. I didn't actually set out to write a book initially anyway. I started doing a study of an Irish Jew living in San Francisco. I was living in San Francisco, I lived there for 7 years, and I had come across this name Albert Bender in connection with a previous book I did about Dorothy Lang, a great American photographer. And she had been friendly with this Irish Jew who lived in San Francisco and was a great patron of the arts in the 1920s and 1930s. And he only got one line or maybe 2 lines of that biography of Dorothy Lang, so he's largely an unknown character. And then I found his name popping up in other places, like the autobiography of Ansel Adams, another great American photographer. And when you visit the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, it's a fabulous museum, you'll find quite a few of the paintings by people like Diego Rivera, the great Mexican muralist, Frida Kahlo, the great Mexican, his wife, the great Mexican painter. You'll find, when you look at the titles that beside the paintings, Gift of Albert M. Bender. So Bender kept coming up, and it took me about 6 or 7 years to actually have had the time to actually research Bender. So I started researching Bender around the year 2000, and straight away I found this treasure trove. I mean, he was writing to people like W.B. Yeats. He received presents from Jack Yeats. I mean, I had in my hand in the Bender Archive in Mills College in California, I was holding in my hand a small leather-bound painting book with little doodles and little paintings from the Aran Islands by Jack Yeats. Yeats had come back from the Aran Islands and sent it off to Bender as a present. Priceless. And so my research on Bender, I started off researching this Irish Jew, and later on I tackled a big collection of what looked like boring letters from the National Museum of Ireland from this guy called A. Mahr, maybe Anton Mahr or Alan Mahr, and it turns out that was Dublin Nazi No. 1. So out of that the book grew, but it is ironic that I started off writing about a Jew and ended up writing about a Nazi.
Exactly. It's interesting when you mention that, because if somebody like Bender had, even if they were small sketches or whatever by Yeats, clearly, although he had been in San Francisco and the West Coast for a large period of his life, he clearly kept an interest in Ireland.
He was a paddy.
Yeah.
He was a paddy. Like me, living in San Francisco.
He left here when he was, what, 15, 16?
Yes, very. He was still in his late teens, and he never got back. But like so many Irish expats, you become more Irish than the Irish when you live abroad. I certainly did. I had an interest. I mean, I listened to nothing but Christy Moore and Luca Bloom and stuff like that. I haven't really listened to them since I came home.
And I can identify that.
Yeah, and I was reading. I worked for an Irish community newspaper, and I got involved in Irish drama. All these things that I really wish I did when I got back home, but I didn't need to. And Bender was the same. I mean, he had a party on St. Patrick's Day every year. He claimed it was his birthday. He used to joke with the Californians, that his neighbours and friends, that he shared the same birthday as St. Patrick, because the two of them were mates when they were young in Dublin. What sometimes happens, and even happens to this day, is that you have people who are in a far-flung place like San Francisco, which is so much further in those days than it is today, and they become almost like an embassy, or they become like a stopping off point for visiting academics and artists and musicians. So Bender was the Irishman to contact if you were a lecturer from Dublin who was doing a tour of America. And so he stayed in touch, and his connections with Ireland are like a who's who. Like, he was swapping letters with Jack Yeats, William Butler Yeats, Oliver St. John Gogarty, various other people whose names I can't actually recall at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. How did he make his money?
An insurance man.
Okay.
He was an insurance agent, and clearly made a lot of money quickly and well, and he lived well. Now, he was also a bachelor, so he wasn't supporting kids and supporting the shopping frenzies of a wife around like that, so he had a lot of extra money. And that money, almost all of it went into supporting artists, and he tended to support living artists as opposed to dead ones. He felt that the dead ones didn't need his money, the living ones did. Particularly, we're talking about the time around the Great American Depression.
Sure.
So as that economy crashed, you can imagine the artists were at the very bottom of the pile, and so many of them got commissions from Bender at that crucial time, and that kept body and soul together.
Yeah. Without seeking to be too controversial, Gerry, an artist with an interest in the arts, living in San Francisco, Should we draw any inference in that?
If you're asking, is he gay? Is he gay?
Yeah.
I would think he was gay.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to find that written down anywhere. There is one comment by Dorothy Lang's husband, who's a fabulous painter called Maynard Dixon, absolutely wonderful painter of the American West, and he described Bender in one, I think it was a letter, as a lisping, mincing Jewish homosexual.
Okay, I know. The reason why I raise that is just being controversial, is that you make the point in the book is that Mahr probably knew he was Jewish and played that down to a degree, and I just wonder, would Mahr have found it more off-putting that he was either Jewish or gay? Bearing in mind he was a Nazi.
Yeah. You know, the whole gay thing, homosexual thing, it hardly entered into correspondence.
Okay. It wouldn't really in those days, would it?
And anyway, the idea of San Francisco as a gay capital, that's a 1960s, 1970s, 1980s thing. Back in the 1920s and 30s or even beforehand, I don't think anybody was thinking along those lines.
I thought it was the Weimar.
Oh, sorry, but
it was Berlin
but San Francisco was just another city. It wasn't a gay capital.
I appreciate that. No, it was I'm putting today's values on the past, and but no, it's the reason why I raise that is that had Bender been sending Mahr degenerate art, it might have been a different matter. But what he was actually sending him, as we could see down in Collins Barracks, was works of quality, even if they weren't really very much to do with Ireland.
It's an interesting point. Bender was. Well, I mean, if you consider the broad spectrum of artists who he supported, he really touched on really world-renowned artists. The people I've mentioned, Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, W.B. Yeats, Jack Yeats, most of these were not well known when he dealt with them. Ansel Adams, the greatest painter in the world, was a professional piano player when he met Bender. Bender overnight turned him into a professional photographer. Dorothy Lang, another of the greatest photographers in the world, he was the first person to collect her work as art. You're talking about, even in that short breath there, I listed off 5 or 6 of the world's greatest artists in their genre, and Bender discovered or helped or made them in his own way. So he wasn't conservative because he was dealing with people who were on the edge.
Oh, certainly, if you look at
but none of them were degenerate.
Yes, yeah. Well, they might have put Kahlo and Diego Rivera.
Well, you're right. Kahlo was some of her stuff was really on the edge. You know, was it degenerate?
Well, in Nazi terms, it possibly would have been because she had a severe accident, and as a result of that, she probably wouldn't have met their criteria for being fully human. And plus, she was a friend of Leon Trotsky, which wouldn't have endeared them either.
Kahlo was a half-breed in Nazi terms anyway, because she was half German. That's where she got the name Frida. Her dad, I think her mum was German and her dad was Mexican, or vice versa.
Sure. Yeah. But like Selma Hayek.
Yes, she's a perfect person for that movie.
Yes.
Rivera. Yes, it was that whole period was such a political, all around the world, was such political tensions and theories and everything. So Rivera was a communist, and he actually, if I remember correctly, he met both Stalin and Hitler when he toured Europe around the late 20s, maybe early 30s. I could be wrong. Around that period, he certainly was in the company of both men, so he may have seen Hitler speak. So he would have been vaguely interested. I don't want to say a fan. But he would have been vaguely interested in both Hitler and Stalin. But then, as things evolved, Trotsky and Stalin fell out. Rivera felt he was a Trotskyist rather than a Stalinist. Stalin obviously killed Trotsky, and he would have killed Rivera if he needed to. Certainly Rivera was afraid that he was going to be assassinated by him. So you have splits and splits and splits, and it's hard to sometimes keep track on who should really be a friend of who.
Sure. Now, the issue of how Adolph Mahr came to head up the National Museum is quite an interesting one, and I've quoted your view to many people, and it does actually make sense, is that after independence, well, we had no qualified administrators, didn't make an awful lot of political sense to go looking for British, so they cast the net wide. Hence Adolph Mahr. What was he doing before he came here?
Well, he had been an archaeologist, and he was excavating. He was a Celtic archaeologist excavating the salt mines near Salzburg in Austria, and he spent several years up in the mountains excavating these salt mines, which apparently are the greatest treasure trove of Celtic archaeology, because the salt preserved these bodies, and you have thousands of bodies buried in there that might be 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and they're leather satchels and different things like that. So Mahr was the main guy to start excavating those sites. And while he was up there in this, I mean, we were talking about like the Sound of Music kind of area, very, very high mountains, very, very scenic. During the middle of summer, absolutely gorgeous with lakes and rivers and sunshine and all that. In the middle of winter, miserable, cold, miserable. And he was up in some village, high up in a lonely place in winter time, and he somehow got word that the Irish government was advertising in a German newspaper for a director of Irish archaeology, and Celtic archaeology, it's slight difference, and so he applied, and the Irish government had previously employed a German, an Austrian, in that role. Only the guy had died after a very short period of time, maybe 4 or 5 months in office, and so Mahr applied, and he got the job.
Yeah. So when we talk about Celtic archaeology in that context, I mean, do the Austrians and the Germans mean the same by Celtic archaeology as we would? What are they actually looking for? Are they looking for tools? I mean, they're not going to get these great big crosses, or they're not, you know, are we looking for new granges and nouts and douts out in the middle of Tyrol? Or how did they define it? Or was it some form of what I would call Aryan science in that regard?
You know, the word Celtic, my own personal understanding of the word Celtic is evolving all the time, and I honestly can't give you a proper answer to that, because even you mentioned Naut and Doubt, we're talking about Newgrange, were built around about 2,500 years before Christ. The Celtic period is associated with maybe 300 years after Christ for about 1,000 years, that kind of time, right? And so when people talk about Celtic art, it's sometimes, for example, people will look at the swirls on Newgrange and call it a Celtic design. We're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years before the Celtic era. And so in Ireland alone, there's a confusion over what Celtic means. In fact, there's a strong argument to say Ireland, we're not a Celtic country at all. And it's a controversial thing to say that, but somebody somewhere much better than me needs to hammer out what exactly Celtic means. So really what we're talking about is European, at its loosest term, we're talking about European culture around 1,000 years before Christ to about 1,000 years after Christ.
Yeah, now the reason why I raised this issue is I'm a big fan of Bob Quinn, who was the RTE TV producer now. Bob wrote a fabulous book called The Atlanteans, and he puts it not as a land heritage, because there's very little evidence of a mass migration from Central Europe into Ireland. However, he sees it as a maritime migration. And the reason why I raise that is it probably wouldn't have, Bob's later theory that we're descended from North Africans probably wouldn't have fitted in terribly well in the psyche of Adolph Mahr, and that's why I wonder, was he somebody who was an ideological archaeologist, in other words, who started off with the solution but working his way back to the problem? As I say, I have no answer on it.
Well, I think I can answer that. But first of all, about Bob Quinn, I think Bob Quinn did a great service to Ireland with his first book. More or less said, we're not Celts. And straight away makes you question so many other things. Even Glasgow Celtic, even this Celtic tiger. What are we going to run around calling ourselves something that we aren't, you know? But leaving that aside, Mahr, I've spoken about Mahr to lots of people who are very well qualified in the archaeological world. Very few, I mean, all of them would be aware of his Nazi affiliations. None of those would be affiliated or supportive or sympathetic in any way to that. But I've rarely ever heard a bad word said about his scientific, his archaeological work. So the idea of him starting with a solution and working back, I've never heard that said. And he's often described as the father of archaeology, or the grandfather of Irish archaeology. He trained a whole generation of Irish archaeologists that has led to, you know, people who became the director of the National Museum, professors of Irish archaeology. I've never and even in my own research, I tried to uncover that towards the end of the book. You know, was he part of this kind of Nazi idea, the Aryan race, and all that sort of stuff? You know, these stupid archaeologists who went looking for evidence to support this.
7 years in Tibet sort of thing as well.
Yes, yes, and there's no evidence whatsoever that he was affiliated with those people, or there's no publication. Nobody's ever been able to produce a publication by Mahr that suggests that he was in any way subverting his own science for some political reason.
Sure. Before we talk about his relationship with Albert Bender, I'm perhaps being a bit unfair, and I'm on Adolph Mahr in the sense that I looked and I thought, well, he was probably a good technician, but I'm not necessarily, and as you say, probably a very good teacher, probably a very good administrator, but I'm not necessarily seeing an awful lot of original finds to justify that father of archaeology, or grandfather, because Oscar Wilde's father was out there, Oscar Wilde's parents were out there, there was a whole generation doing things before he ever came on the scene. So I'm just wondering, does his reputation more or less rest on his, shall we say, his competency as an administrator and, dare I say it, as an operator, rather than necessarily as an original archaeologist?
That would be a fair opinion. If you look at it, he had basically 3 phases in his life, maybe 4, right, as an archaeologist. So he trained as a young man, he qualified at maybe around the age of 30, maybe 33, and he spent several years as making finds and writing those finds up in the south, up in the salts and plats up around that mountainous part of Austria, and that's regarded as being very good work. Then he came over to Ireland, learned a whole new branch of archaeology, and that time is marked by absolutely good, very, very good quality administration, building the museum, not from a bricks and mortar point of view, but from an administrative point of view, and training, as I said that earlier on, the first generation of Irish archaeologists. Oscar Wilde's parents were effectively British archaeologists who were based in this island. It was a British outlook, it wasn't an Irish outlook. The people Mahr trained, like Raftery and O'Riordan and various people like that, were Irish archaeologists. They were from this land, from an Irish point of view, excavating Ireland. And so that's where he gets the reputation as father or grandfather of archaeology. During that time, he himself was on digs, but he wasn't digging because he was the director of the museum. So he brought in, for example, the Harvard mission, who brought the archaeologists from Harvard, who brought scientific archaeology to Ireland for the first time. And that is now the way excavations are done in Ireland. It's a very, very scientific process with small brushes, and you're measuring the finds as opposed to just yanking stuff out of the ground going, hey, we found a sword, you know. So he brought in those methods. So that period that he was working in Ireland, that was from 1927 until 1939. So that was a 12-year period where he himself would not have been, he would have been writing manuscripts but not actually digging. And then from 1939 to 1945, he was, this is the war, he was involved in Irish radio, but he wasn't an archaeologist as such. And after the war, he was going through the whole denazification process. He was imprisoned, he was very ill. So it took him about 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years to recover from the war. And then he was dead 2 years after that, just when he was trying to get his career back again. So if it weren't for the war, I think he would have established himself as a world-class archaeologist, whereas I think he probably established himself as a world-class archaeological administrator and archaeological thinker and innovator, but getting down and dirty, no, he didn't get that opportunity.
Yeah. The chances are, Adolph Mahr being Austrian, he would have been Catholic. So when he came here, and I'm just dividing it up between what I would call after 432 or before 432, you would have had religious archaeology after that period of time, and not, if you like, non-religious before that. What was his major focus? Did he tend to focus on that post 432 period, or the what we would call the prehistoric phase?
Well, first of all, he himself wasn't religious. Just to point that out, his own parents had raised him without religion. They purposely avoided Catholicism, and as a result, Mahr's kids the same, and that actually hurt him later on after the war. We maybe come to that later on. So, pardon me. So he did publish, and particularly one of his more famous books is work he did come up to the 1932 Eucharistic Congress. De Valera asked him to produce a book on Christian art in ancient Ireland. I don't think that he himself had any great personal interest in Christian art. It was just archaeology, and that's what he was asked to research, and that's what he did, and he did very, very well. I think when you look back long enough, I mean, the two great artifacts that will ever come out of the ground in archaeology are religious items and war items.
Sure.
You know, they're either a crucifix or a sword, and in fact, if you turn one upside down, you get the other very often, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, invariably, people end up writing about the things that they find, and these are the things that last 1,000 years, you know. And books don't last so long in the ground, and other pieces of art, pictures drawn, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think he was a religious man.
Okay. At what point do we know that he became that he shall we say embraced Nazism? Because I don't like the term became a Nazi. It's not like it's an inherent condition or something like that. But you make the point that he was an enthusiastic one. Was that before he came here, or did he? Like you were mentioning, was this his Christy Moore while he was abroad, sort of thing? You know, pining for Strauss and Bayreuth and you know, the rallies and things like that.
Well, I think it was like a lot of things. It came slowly and quickly, right? The German colony, that's what they call themselves.
Sure.
Mahr was Austrian, but they were Germanic people, right? The German colony had been meeting in Ireland and Dublin. The expatriates living mostly in Dublin had been gathering from the late 1920s, and like a bunch of paddies over in Germany, for example, they met. They wanted to bring the families together. They wanted to give their kids an opportunity to speak German. They wanted to taste German food and talk about the homeland, you know. So that had been going on before the Nazis came to power. When the Nazis got to power in 1933, they Nazified everything. So the German colony became the Nazi party. The children who were part of the German colony became Hitler Youth. That happened in Germany and happened in the satellite countries, you know. So Mahr the primary link with the Nazi party would have been a social thing that pre-existed Nazism, pre-existed Nazi party getting to power, you know. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, he came in on a wave of popular support from a very, very proud, middle-class, organised type of people who had been really, really, really down in the dumps. You could argue that maybe they deserved it. I don't think anybody would agree with that anymore, but there's no doubt that the Germanic people, be they German or Austrian, had a desperate time throughout the 1920s, and Mahr himself had a desperate time. Leading on from World War I, the German people felt very, very hard done by the aftermath of the First World War. They felt that their country was diced up. They felt that their economy was ruined, and Mahr himself felt that. Remember, Mahr lived in Vienna with his wife. They lived in poverty, even though he was from a kind of middle-class bandsman family, even though he was a qualified architect, you know, so he was educated, and she was from a middle-class Dutch family. They lived in poverty. I think that the mother was depressed at that time, Maria Mahr, particularly after having Gustav, their first child. She lost her second pregnancy. We know from Mahr's letters what a desperate time they were having. He was selling his books in order to pay for food. In other words, you're selling your fixed assets in order to pay for your current assets. It's a bad time. Sure. And he also had to, when he did sell his books, he had to spend that money as quickly as possible because of hyperinflation. So if you got money in the morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, you spend it at 10 o'clock in the morning, because if you wait at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that money is devalued. So he and millions of Germans, Germanic people like him, knew hyperinflation, they knew absolute poverty, they knew old people who died because of the cold, they knew children who died from malnutrition, and suddenly Hitler came along and said, hey, we can change all this, I'll make you proud again. And that was what Mahr hooked onto. And on top of all that, Hitler said, I'm going to reunite the German people. And Mahr was a Sudeten German, and the Sudetenland had been cut off Germany and given to the Czechoslovakians. Mahr didn't like the Czechs. He was also born in the South Tyrol, which had been cut off Germany and given to Italy. So Hitler came along and says, Sudetenland, going to bring it to Germany. South Tyrol, going to bring it to Germany. So that was two big reasons for Mahr to support Hitler. So this whole, you see, nowadays we look back at Hitler and it's all about hating the Jews and all this sort of stuff, which of course is part of it, but that would not have been paramount in Mahr's mindset. I don't think he hated the Jews.
Sure.
He certainly didn't hate individual Jews. He had several Jewish friends. There was Jewish kids playing in the house. He did hate what he called international Jewry, this conspiracy, as in his mind, of Jews in Russia and America and Britain and Germany who were conspiring to do down their host country. And Hitler, of course, came along and pressed that button for so many people.